So you can see my talk today is the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine used in the adults. We all know that the conjugate vaccine is well in the invasive pneumococcal disease. But in the elderly, we are concerned about if we focus on the non-bacteremic pneumococcal pneumonia. If the conjugate vaccine can coverage all this kind of elderly, I think it's a great impact on the elderly's health. So that's my job to maybe introduction the content to you. So we know that pneumococcus is still the #1 isolated pathogen in the CAP. This is study done in the United States 2015. You can see here the isolated pathogen around 38%. But we look at the pathogen identified beyond the virus, you know the pneumococcus is still the #1 pathogen. So it's a very important issue. I think we well know about that. And talk about adult pneumococcal disease. And I think in the pediatric, the invasive type is very important. But as I mentioned, the non-invasive type, especially the non-bacteremic pneumonia, is consists around 75% of the adult pneumococcal disease. So that's why the importance of the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, even prevention, especially non-bacterial pneumonia, I think it's a great impact on their health. So we look at the risk of IPD or pneumococcal disease. I think the same to look at in the pediatric. We see from the age or at risk, high risk, especially age younger or elderly, especially 65-year-old. At risk is they have a comorbidity. For example, they have heart, lung, or any kind of liver disease. And high risk is the same of HIV or cancer, solid cancer, or autoimmune disease or immune suppression status. The environmental factors means that if they got a virus infection post-virus, or behavior is smoking or alcohol use. So that's all the importance we look at the elderly, how to cover, which is in priority need to be coverage. And further, I will talk about the development of pneumococcal vaccine and its efficacy and effectiveness. And we know that conjugate vaccine from the PCV 7, 10, 13, 15. The major difference, I think we know that coverage of 19A or 3 or serotype 1. But we look at the polysaccharide, it seems they cover a very broad variety of serotype. So the first question is, how about the conjugate vaccine and the polysaccharide vaccine to coverage the prevalent of serotype in certain area? Then we need to look at this. So it's the study done from Taiwan to look at IPD. You can see the orange bar is conjugate vaccine, the gray bar is the polysaccharide vaccine. Look at the different age category, they in average cover the same percentage, so it's around 80%. In general, the overall is 80%. So first question is, I think is especially in Taiwan, I think in Asia country is the same. The conjugate vaccine PCV 13 and polysaccharide for the more prevalent serotype, the coverage is around the same. So the second question comes to, okay, how about the immunogenicity of a different type of vaccine? I think it's important the conjugate vaccine, they contain polysaccharide antigen and link to a protein carrier. So it's a different type of immunogenicity from antigen presenting. Then by this way, they stimulate the T cell to help the B cell to produce antibody, especially into the memory B cell pathway. So it's very important for the memory B cell. If further any pathogen invade, the immune response will quickly exist. And it's very important why the conjugate vaccine have very consistent immunogenicity and very effective antibody production. So we can take a look about the head-to-head comparison about the conjugate vaccine and polysaccharide vaccine. For this person, injection conjugate vaccine, this person polysaccharide vaccine, then corrected 1 month later. On this figure, for the numerator divided by denominator, if the ratio greater than 1, then you can see the graphic. The dot is around the right hand side this area. So it means the denominator antibody response is greater than the denominator. So you can see from this graphic, all the different serotype is all greater than 1. So it means the conjugate vaccine, they have a greater immunogenicity than the polysaccharide vaccine. So how about the sequential administration? So here, first conjugate, then 1 year later polysaccharide versus polysaccharide only. So it's the same. You look at this graphic, the ratio from different serotypes is always greater than 1. So it means for the vaccine naive patient, you inject polysaccharide first, then polysaccharide conjugate first, then polysaccharide later. There's no any impairment of immunogenicity. So it's quite important why we apply this policy in the adult, in the elderly. So always polysaccharide first, conjugate first, and then the polysaccharide later. So how about the repeat injection of polysaccharide? I think here this study shows quite clearly, if a patient polysaccharide first, then repeated injection of polysaccharide, and compared to later on conjugate vaccine, the antibody response is totally different. So how come repeat injection of polysaccharide vaccine attenuate the immunogenicity? I think it's a phenomenon we call it hyporesponsiveness or immune tolerance. So if the patient inject the polysaccharide first, they build the plasma cell to immune response, but repeated injection, they found there was depletion in the memory B cell, and especially the vaccine antigen will bind to the naive B cell, so that later immune response attenuate. So that's why if only just repeated inject the polysaccharide vaccine, this immune tolerance happen. So since the apply of polysaccharide vaccine in the adult, in the elderly, it's so many years, but you can look at the literature, the consistency is inconsistent, and especially the durability is questionable. So we can look at the recent study in Japan, and they look at the vaccine serotype specific effectiveness of the polysaccharide. They got a conclusion the vaccine efficacy is around 27%. And very importantly, they follow up all these elderly patients. Then you can see here the immunogenicity around at 1 month to 2 years is very effective. But following time, you can see the 2 years, 5 years later, all the effective wane is gone. So it's very important. That's why the polysaccharide vaccine used in the adult, in elderly, the protection is very short period of time. So since the usage of conjugate vaccine, we can know that initially used in the pediatric, but since the 2011, it started to use in the adult. Then the adult initially from the age greater than 50 and with some risk, immunocompromised, etc. Then later on, they expanded the indication from the age of 19, but still need some risk factor. But it's a very landmark study. It completed in the 2014. I think it's very important to address the issue I mentioned. If the vaccine, especially conjugate vaccine, can coverage the non-bacteremic cap, then the broad elderly population can cover. So the study is positive. So later on, all the United States and EU, they recommend the conjugate vaccine in the age, even the greater than 65. even without any risk factor, they recommend it. So we can see the epidemiology of the IPD in United States elderly person. Then you can see initially the introduction of PCV in the pediatric, and little bit a herd effect happened. But later on, it's very important the recommended conjugate vaccine in the elderly. Then you can see the effect of the decrease. The IPD instance is consistently lowering. So I think the introduction of a conjugate vaccine for the elderly IPD is very effective. But how about still the same issue? How about the non-bacteremic or non-invasive type? So I think the CAPITA study gives some solution of this. It's a phase 4 randomized placebo-controlled study. It's done in the Netherlands and enroll many person, around 85,000 person. They randomized, divided one in the conjugate vaccine group and one is the placebo group. They look at the endpoint. First is vaccine type pneumococcal cap, and second is the non-bacteremic pneumococcal cap. Third is the IBD. And then check the immunogenicity for the person they inject the conjugate vaccine 1 month later. Then you take a look, the different bar in serotype, different bar, the color show even the healthy or they have a comorbidity, the different underlying disease, the same serotype, even they have a different risk or without risk, the immunogenicity is the same. So this study, they follow the person around 4 years. It's quite a long duration. They found first the primary endpoint and the secondary endpoint around the 45% vaccine efficacy. For IBD, a little bit higher. But remember, I talked about the polysaccharide vaccine in Japan. It's about 27. I think still is a very huge number difference compared all the elderly person. Then they do a follow-up study, just a post-hoc analysis, because they for the CAPITA study they enroll around 85,000, but they have a different at risk or without risk. So they look at if they have a risk, how about the vaccine efficacy? So you can hear in general CAPITA study, as I mentioned, about 45% efficacy. If they look at the subgroup, if they have a risk or without risk, a risk around 40%. And without risk, that means they just elderly without underlying comorbidity, the vaccine efficacy can very high, about 67%. So once again, prove efficacy, and especially about the durability of the protection period. So they follow up, extend the follow-up period over the 5 years. So no matter is the non-bacteremic vaccine type cap or the IPD, you can see the two graphic, the placebo and the conjugate vaccine always separate. So it's very important to mention. So from this graphic, we can know that the conjugate vaccine for the elderly person, they have a persistent, constant protection, and even divided by the at risk or without risk, you can see the two graphics still the same. So I think it's very important for this study give us some information from the here we use the conjugate vaccine. You can protect the elderly very effective. But it's an efficacy study. So how about in the real world? In the real world, the effectiveness. This is a study done in the United States. It's Roosevelt in Kentucky. So it's trying to answer this question. Since the introduction for the United States ACIP in the 2014, that recommended all the elderly receive the conjugate vaccine. So let's want to know since that time till the study end, during that period, how about a CAP patient? Then they measure the etiology of the CAP. So any vaccine type, serotype CAP or not. So it's like a test negative design. From this design, they have a control and the cases to compare and look at the vaccine effectiveness. So they enroll patients here. You can know that very old age and different comorbidity. You can know COPD, heart failure, diabetes, etc. It's kind of refreshing a very real world in the elderly situation. So they look at the different confounder even by age, gender, race, or BMI, etc. So the vaccine effectiveness around 70%. So it's very constant even in the real world. The vaccine effectiveness is still very effective. So at the end, they concluded from the study, the vaccine effectiveness, even from different sensitive analysis, the effectiveness around 65 to 72. So I think it's very important, even from the CAPTA is an effective study. But in the real world, especially in the United States, the effectiveness is still the same. I think the protective effect we can look from the study to prove it. So how about the adult pneumococcal immunization program worldwide? So if important, over 50 countries worldwide, they recommended adult vaccination with PCV13 conjugate vaccine. And here is the COPD GO guideline. They recommended for the old age 65 with COPD, they need to give some pneumococcal vaccine. And here is the United States ACIP recommendation. Initially, in the September 2014, they recommended age greater than 65, no matter they have with or without any risk factor. But later on, they get a little bit revised. And last year, November, if the 65 they without any risk factor, maybe can discuss with the person with shared decision making. But I think it's kind of policy expression. But I think for the adults, I always told to my patients, we need to concern your personal risk factor. If cost effective, because it's not reimbursement in Taiwan, so we need to consider your own personal risk factor. So it's very important, I think, for the personnel, if the elderly person, even they without risk factor, if the gut infection, the pneumococcal cap, later on there's a big trouble. So here they mention if the age after 65, naive person first conjugate vaccine, then 1 year later polysaccharide vaccine. If you receive the polysaccharide vaccine first, then 1 year apart the conjugate vaccine. But before 65, you have a polysaccharide vaccine, then we'll recount. So after 65, conjugate vaccine first, then later on polysaccharide vaccine. So in summary, I think the conjugate vaccine is more potent than the polysaccharide vaccine. And the vaccine coverage in Asian area, I think the conjugate is around the same with the polysaccharide. And especially very important, conjugate vaccine has immune boosting effect. But the repeat injection of polysaccharide has an immune tolerance. I think it's a very important issue. So if you ever receive polysaccharide, then you can reshot 1 year later with the conjugate. So I think the take-home message I mentioned, so for the ACIP in the United States recommended, I think the strong evidence from the CAPTA study, from the vaccine captain study, and age about 18 to 65 would depend on the risk. No doubt polysaccharide first. So vaccine naive patient is use conjugate vaccine. But how about the protection period? I think the 10 year since the introduction in 2011, right now it's 10 years. But how about the longer? I think need to epidemiological study to look out. Maybe some person need to reshot with polysaccharide or not. I think it's very important we can clarify this. Okay, that's my talk today. Thank you.